So good afternoon. I'm Chitra, Partnerships Chair of the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium. And thank you for joining us at this roundtable discussion on innovation while virtual in the International Partners booth. And I'm so pleased to welcome Jason Marsh, CEO of Flow Immersive, and Michael DiBenigno, Head of Business and also co-founder of Flow Immersive, to tell us a lot about immersive data visualization, data storytelling, and more, and what they're doing and who their clients are. And we're very excited to have you. So I'm going to turn this over to Jason. And just a note for our participants, once the presentation is completed, we will be asking you to raise your hand via reactions in Zoom, and you can ask your questions directly to our panelists. So thank you so much, and Jason, here you go.
Thank you, Chitra. It's a really pleasure to be here. I'm Jason, as you've mentioned, and we founded Flow about 5 years ago. And my personal background is in enterprise SaaS software, 30 years of enterprise software. So I'm a technical founder. Flow is really focused on the problem of how we can communicate more effectively, more engagingly, more interactively with an audience, particularly around data, around making better data-driven decisions. And I would argue that there's a lot of data in the world. There needs to be more all the time. That's how we are going to solve our humanity's biggest problems. But I would argue that the data communication piece of that pipeline is the problem. If you think of it as a network, it's the last mile problem. It's the fiber to your home problem, where you've got this massive data, but how can you get it into the minds of your audience in a powerful, effective way, quickly, where they understand it, where they engage with it, and they care about it. And data storytelling is starting to be a real thing, starting to be a nice sub-discipline, and we're one of the first data storytelling tools on the market. And we happen to also do that in augmented reality, which will show you a little bit, but data storytelling and better data-driven decision-making is, I think, the big challenge of this next century.
Perfect. And hi, everybody. So I'm Michael DiBenigno. I'm the other side of this this team here. And I'm a MIT Sloan alum, so I do have some connection back to MIT. So it feels good to come back here and share some insights. In terms of this discussion, where we're talking through how organizations are leveraging technology to better engage and work better remotely. We very much have focused in on the problem of how do you communicate with data, which I think is often a use case that's very prevalent. And we're very interested to hear what others with other types of content have really tried to do and found innovation in. But before I jump into those areas as a general discussion, I'm going to give a bit more background on what we've seen in the market and a little bit more about Flow and help seed in your mind sort of what we do and some of the insights of what we've learned along the way. So I'm going to share my screen this way. And so, what are we doing at Flow? Ultimately, what we're doing is we're solving three fundamental problems with any sort of communication when it comes to data. And I think you could extend this beyond data possibly. So one is levels of engagement. Is your audience actually paying attention, or are they on mute, checking their email, doing something else during your Zoom call, right? Two is levels of understanding. Especially when it comes to complex data, do you really comprehend those insights, or are you just sort of saying, okay, and moving on? And then last is levels of interaction. Right now, this form is a little bit, one to many. I'm presenting out sort of to the world, as opposed to having this many-to-many interaction or feeling like you're really participating in the meeting. And if we can solve those three things, that's how we drive essentially better data-driven decisions, or in a sales use case, sales conversions, or an education use case, better education. All of these components have to, work together in order to actually have these conducted meetings. And so that's what our clients at the United Nations, at Deloitte, at the World Bank have found. It's like when you get these ingredients right, that's how we start to move things forward. And so where we fit into this world is we're not a presentation, so it's not sort of the summed up version of the world, and it's also not a dashboard which has lots of options and sort of more for exploration. It's how do you add a narrative to data? You're providing a story, you're adding empathy to data points to help drive a perspective or point of view, to help drive action. And that's ultimately what we're solving for. So it's through that data storytelling and this interactive visualization process that we're helping to engage audience in solving some of those core problems. So as an illustrative example of this is a map of the 2020 election on a county by county level. And you might recall back in 2016, Donald Trump would tout that the whole country voted red and show a map that sort of looked like this. But the counter argument to that is that land doesn't vote, people vote. And that if we start to actually add in the magnitudes here, a different story emerges, one where we can see that most of the population centers in the US are Democrat. And so let me take this one step forward for anyone here. And I'm going to open up this QR code, as well as a link, which I'll put into the chat window. And if I can encourage people to either scan that QR code with your phone to open up the site, which will actually join this meeting live, or if you click on that link that is in the chat window, you'll be entered into this immersive environment, and we can actually go through this together. So this idea of like, how do we more effectively engage and how do we interact? This is part of it, right? It's not only that you can see my face and the data at the same time while I'm presenting, but that you can actually participate, that you can point to things. And so if you're on your computer, I would encourage you to click and drag, and that will move you around the environment on your flat screen. And then on your phone, you can touch and move around. And then if you are feeling adventurous, you can go into AR mode as well to actually go walk around the content. And yeah, so on this last step, just taking it one step further, which is to say that we can change the colors of these dots so that the world is, not so binary. It's not so just Democrat, Republican, but rather it's a little bit more purple when you look at the real ratio between Democrats and Republicans. And so, this is all to really point to how can we use different perspectives, look at the data through different lenses to derive more meaningful insights, and as well as feel part of this meeting, that we can interact, we can point to things. One thing that's very small is this idea that you can point to a dot and click on that dot. And to a non-expert, that's a very empowering thing. How do you drive engagement? You do it by taking down these barriers and encouraging people to reach out, to interact, to point to things, ask questions. And that's how we start to drive more meaningful engagements while remote. And just to extend this a little further, what is data? So what I showed you last was sort of a geospatial analysis, but we could also look at network graphs and how does, COVID as an example, reproduce and how does it spread through a population? Or in this instance, we're looking at foot traffic data, where we can look over all of last year where people were going. And we see this decline, when the pandemic hit pretty much everywhere. And then during the summer, you can see what I call the Home Depot effect of everyone getting sick of their all the defects they found in their house being quarantined and starting a DIY project or going to Home Depot to resolve. And so, it's through these narratives, it's through the storytelling that's where we've found the most engagement. Just to present data doesn't drive insight or meaning, but to add that story, people remember the story, and the data adds the credibility layer. By combining those things together, you form a really powerful package. And so that's really what we've seen. And we can go through, lots of other examples and talk more about, some of the things that the United Nations has done, the World Bank and others. But hopefully at a high level, that makes sense in terms of sort of how we've addressed the problem. We're trying to solve for those sort of three core problems that we see in virtual communication overall.
Great. Tell us a little bit more about data storytelling, Michael. What exactly is it? What are the elements of data storytelling?
Sure. So if we think about the two pieces, there's the data and then there's the story. Yeah. So we'll sort of tackle each of them separate because I think they actually each have their own domain. When we think about the raw data, I like to almost imagine like a sort of like your data analyst sort of on the computer, typing away, finding these insights. You're really in the Excel sheet, you're immersed in the data, and you're trying to find the insights, whether it be a predictive model, something that helps to explain the data in a emergent way. The story side is the human elements. It's who answered that survey. It's what does the data, how does that impact our lives? How does that impact sort of the larger scope? So, how does this insights that we found in the data drive our bottom line or impact our customers or impact the world? One example we always point to is climate change. Yeah. So if we think about climate change data, we have all these repositories of pretty complex elements of data. And it's the story elements that help us understand how these climate change is actually impacting us. And it's by combining those two things together that we can actually drive more impact and more meaning. Jason, would you like to add on to that?
I think you nailed it well. I mean, one thing to just, kind of describe is that we didn't invent data storytelling as a methodology. Certainly Nancy Duarte had a lot to do with that as part of even going back to the Al Gore Inconvenient Truth. In a way, that movie was a new high bar in the art of data storytelling, right? Where you see there's a lot of data, but it's communicated with this emotional component, that powerful emotional component. And it resolves that disconnect, right? Data can just be statistics, and stories, anecdotes can just be anecdotes, have their limited view. And by taking a dot and saying, this dot means this is a person, this is their life experience, and then being able to step up and see that across the whole picture, seeing the forest and the trees and the leaves and the details. How do you touch both the heart and the mind in the minds of your audience and hearts of your audience, and put that together? It can be a really powerful combination.
I mean, it seems to me, Jason and Michael, that emotional component, especially in the last year during the pandemic, probably has become even more important and more powerful in terms of what you're bringing forth, right? Because that's part of the missing link here. So we'd love to hear more about that. But then before I can certainly start asking some questions from the audience, but in the meantime, what are some of your clients actually doing, with your platform? What kinds of problems are they actually solving practically?
Yeah. And one thing I just want to hit right before we jump into sort of more examples from our client portfolio is just to illustrate that what we found really important for all these communication elements is that you need to meet people where they are. One thing we keep saying is you want to lead a horse to water, you don't want to dunk its head in. And in a similar sense, you don't want to force someone to have to wear, in our case, the VR or AR headsets in order to be part of a conversation or hear a story. And the reason I say that is one thing we've found is that by actually just creating some videos, so we created video content similar to this, where we go through a data story. This is actually a live data story I'm showing where we had 25 people in the environment itself, where we're talking through this content live. And that level of engagement was there, but just this aspect of I can record this video and send this video to someone is actually really powerful, because you're breaking down that barrier of like, oh, I had to be there live in the meeting, I can just go review it after. So I think that's sort of an important element here that I just want to make sure to hit upon. So we're not focused too much on the AR, VR aspect of that. And Jason, did you want to maybe start talking a little bit more about the UN, and then I can talk more about some of the Deloitte and World Bank stuff?
And then Alan has a question after you're done. We will ask him. Go ahead.
Perfect.
So I think what's been fun with the UN is the way it's resonated so interestingly with so many different parts of the UN, right? We started with a couple of short pieces for the General Assembly, and it's really just kind of taken off throughout the organization over the last 9 months. It's been very exciting. I mean, we've done projects for the Uzbekistan country office on the Aral Sea. We've done projects for the Zimbabwe on the informal economy, particularly as it's impacted by droughts and COVID from the last year. This is an example of the climate change this was part of the General Assembly, actually, looking at the warmest and coldest months of the last few years here. So, or the last 200 years. But the idea that you can have a deep conversation, get into a deep conversation quickly around these topics, instead of just staying at a surface level, is really important. And they seem to have really resonated well with them. Think about the way someone experiences this kind of a presentation versus a typical flat Zoom screen. So in a way, this is how COVID has done well for us. I think that people are zoomed out and they start to have these more serious conversations with, you know, this kind of interactive graphic environment. Yeah, that's not only fun, but meaningful. And that's important success.
One thing I'll quickly add on to what Jason's mentioning is that I think what we found is that we're part of a larger movement at organizations, that it's not just about how do I enhance my presentation or how do I enhance this data, but how do we actually become more of a data-driven organization? So as we're making decisions, how do we make sure data is a key element of it? And so in some sense, by forcing someone to actually use data visualizations and use the data, they are faced with the data. They have to actually they have to explain the data in front of them and make decisions from it. Whereas before you could just sort of simplify, put things in 3 bullets and have your conversation or have a strategy that's sort of top down. But when you actually are face to face with the data, sometimes that doesn't line up. We've actually seen that firsthand where they have a hypothesis, but when you actually dig into the data, it's not supportive of your hypothesis. And so in those instances, I think we've actually been helping push this movement towards how do we enable more data-driven exploration or data-driven decisions.
I mean, it seems to me that data can feel rather dry and non-appealing. So I think part of what you're doing is also making it appealing, right? And, you know, stimulate that conversation. I'm going to go to Alan. And Alan, please do go ahead with your question.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Chitra. I actually have a couple of related questions. So the first one is that there's an old saying that there's 3 types of liars. There's liars, darn liars, and statistics. And so when you're making these presentations with data and it does illustrate it to the audience, how do you build audience confidence that in fact the data is telling a trustworthy narrative?
Credibility is a huge motivator behind what we're doing, being able to communicate credibly. So my first answer is using data is going to be more credible than not using data. Second, being able to show that, hey, we're looking at every single dot. Every single dot is a thing, as opposed to summing it up into abstract rectangles, usually only a few rectangles in a bar chart. Yes, a bar chart can be meaningful. I'm not saying it's not, but even that abstraction of turning everything into rectangles, and then every slide is a different rectangle, and you've got to get your brain around each slide as they go by, that removes some of the credibility. The last piece is something that you've noticed with our system probably already, is how the dots move from place to place, how everything is animating, all of which is designed to give everything a better sense of the concrete. If you can see one data set moving from one space to another space, you're getting a different level of concreteness in your mind. So that's my quick answer. Of course, you can take any, the devil can quote scripture and do it well. So you can take any data and twist it to your means. on at least on some level, if you're trying to help people understand and you're trying to solve problems, you do want to be convincing and you do want to be persuasive. And that's what we're enabling people to do. And hopefully we're not letting people lie. People won't lie too much with their statistics, but it is possible. We just think that credibility is more important.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, sure. I was just gonna, quickly add on to that point, which is, I think data can have the effect of sort of being this cornerstone by which you can form opinions and have different viewpoints. But I think too often, or at least what we found, is that too often things are being led by anecdotes, whether it be in the news, that you hear the anecdotal story as opposed to the underlying data. And so one such example, I think, is actually what happens in Texas during the winter storm and what happens in ERCOT. So, I feel like you either heard one story, which is that wind was the whole culprit and the whole clean energy thing was the issue, or you heard that it was, basically the states, didn't have enough capacity, they didn't winterize, all these different, narratives. And instead of focusing on the data, to drive those opinions, it was formed on anecdotes, like, oh, I saw this thing freezing up or blah, blah, blah. And I think what we've helped to do is bring all of that data together, show one unified perspective where you can look at every generation type and see how they declined over time and through the instance. And so, in many regards, I think, yes, there's definitely room to massage your message with any data visualization. But I would say that it's very difficult to do, and using data adds that credibility layer. But the thing everyone remembers will be the antidote. But combining those two, I think, is really where you see that powerful combination.
Yeah, I mean, I think this sort of brings to mind one of the challenges. So what are some of the barriers to adoption? What challenges are you seeing? What are some myths that you're facing in bringing the sport to organizations? And I guess your target audience are organizations, right? So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I can talk just a little bit about one of the big myths in sort of more the spatial world. Mm-hmm. So this is more in the XR environments. There's the fantasy that I'm going to throw my data in 3 dimensions and suddenly every insight's going to just come to me. Just going to be the matrix just like loading into my head and everything's just going to be absorbed. And unfortunately, data analysis still requires effort and focus, and finding insights is not necessarily just immediate. There are benefits in terms of what you can do in 3D and some analysis use cases, but I think more so what we've found is that the spatial environment's way better for communicating and sort of matching our mental pictures, but not necessarily just a end all be all for the absorption of data. Jason, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm really careful to do is not sell on cool and not overdo the novelty factor of this. So I think a lot of people think of this and go, oh, that's just like a sci-fi movie, or that's like a game. Well, it is like a sci-fi movie. We've seen it in 100 sci-fi movies, data and information floating above your desk in front of you in augmented reality. That just proves that there's a meaningful use case there. And the interactions you can have by leaning in to the data instead of trying to manipulate it with your mouse or whatever is actually really meaningful. But cool is, I think, a technical term. I've got a technical definition for it, which is mastery and control. So let's think about that just for a minute. So what's a great, cool skateboard trick, right? Or the BMW driving experience where you feel the road, or even Iron Man flicking atoms working with Jarvis, right? Essentially what we're doing is we're experiencing that mastery and control. And if we can give you that feeling of mastery and control over your information, and your audience has that also that ability to play with it, to lean in, to experiment with it. Essentially what you're doing is efficiency. It's not about just, oh, that's cool, that's neat, that's a novelty. It's a more efficient way of communicating this complexity to an audience. So cool is not it's not what we sell on, but yeah, what we do is cool.
I mean, I actually am, I'm very interested in product design, and, have your clients applied this platform to their product design, prototyping, product development process? And how would they go about that?
Yeah.
Not as much, especially if you're talking about, 3D modeling and that exploration of, building widgets or real estate visualization.
Yeah.
There's a lot of companies doing that very, very well. And
Okay.
there's a great use cases, but we're a little bit more, we're uniquely focused on data and presentation, more for the knowledge worker, for a broad use case, as opposed to meeting any particular product design challenge. If you want to design your product and understand the financials behind it, or understand the geographic distribution of that, of where it's coming to go and all of the data around it, that's where we would come in.
I mean, would one use case be around, so you have a virtual team innovating around the globe, and you're developing a new product line, and you're trying to understand your customers, or even, trying to get some data really on customer experience. Would that be a particular use case that would be of value? Because is it more around the process of innovation where you can enhance that decision making? I'm just trying to apply that to the design process.
Yeah. Let me take that one actually. So I think what we found is that we always have to start with sort of a beachhead. Where do we add the most value? And we add the most value in any sort of external communications first. So in the sales use case, people are trying to sell a product or service, and it's a hard thing to describe. So they need to, use data to help support their decision. If they have an IT software, things like that. But what we're finding is that people start there, and they also start in sort of like, the World Bank has been publishing visualizations. They actually won an award, I think 3 months ago, on one of the visualizations they built with Flow, which was really exciting. And so it's that, ability to reach sort of a large audience or a very targeted audience in a sales high value use case. And then as we expand from there, then these more internal use cases for design review, for customer journey mapping, all sorts of internal use cases, which we are championing with some other partners, like at Deloitte and others, where there are some more targeted use cases where we're helping assist collaboration that's really high stakes, but mostly internal. So that's sort of more of our trajectory. So I think we'll get there and be helpful for those reviews, but we sort of have to start with the highest value first, as opposed to sort of trying to be something for every meeting.
Our immediate beachheads are in financial services, lots of data, as you can imagine, consulting, and public policy. Got
it. But certainly there is potential down the line, because I mean, this talk about the topic is innovation while virtual, right? So
right.
That's a very, relevant, important, critical, process with all of these teams being virtual, and having a tool that could facilitate that interaction. And obviously you have a particular target would be extremely valuable. Can you tell us a little bit more about your World Bank, and if you can disclose how they're using your product?
Sure. Yeah. So this was one of the flows they built around universal access to electricity. There's actually an audio narration through this whole thing, which I'm not playing, so you'll unfortunately just have to hear my voice. I'm talking this through. But this is a presentation looking at access to electricity. One thing I think we all take for granted, and even just that last story I was sharing around Texas, and just how vital it is, to the world. And I won't go through all the details of the story that they were conveying, but looking at when access was, or when they have access, and how many people still don't have access, how things are progressing on a country by country basis, and really conveying that story to the world. So this was one instance where they had a story they were trying to share publicly. And so they did that actually in headsets, on flat screens, and a variety of other means. But the idea that this can just be embedded on a website, they can just share this link to people is a powerful component of how they share the story. So that's a little bit. And Jason, do you want to add any more to this?
No, beautifully described.
Okay, thanks.
Alan, did you have a question?
Yeah, and I don't know if this is a question specific to Flow, but you guys have put together an extremely powerful way of visualizing data that's frankly impressive. And yet, when I think about data in general, people sometimes confuse correlation with causation. And, now they have a yet more powerful tool to try to draw these connections. And, what guidance do you give people to be clear-minded about their analysis of data?
It's a little, it can be frustrating to realize that the best data visualization just helps you ask more and deeper questions. So as you is the point to be the end all be all of a conversation, or is it to engage that audience in such a way that that they'll be able to find their own conclusions, that think meaningfully about the discussion, to have a shared mental model, maybe a shared 3D mental model of our information. And that is the way our brains work. We actually do think in 3D. I think we've forgotten that with all our flat screens and books and services. So that's how I would approach the question. We
Actually, that makes me think about it. When you are working with a client, how do you approach introducing this to their teams? Like, some of these things that you're talking about, what kind of guidance do you give to them to use this effectively?
Yeah, it's all very incremental. I want to just add on real quick to what Jason was mentioning on the correlation versus causation elements. And what I would say is that if someone came to me and showed me a presentation with data in it, where they had some hunch of like this correlation or this causation or causal effect, they had the data and showed it to me, I would much rather have that conversation than, oh, I have a hunch that this thing is this is related to that. So the fact that we're actually having a conversation with the data in front of us and then discussing and arguing, I think actually is the right thing to happen. So I'd rather see that more than see that less in some regards. So I think that's sort of one element of it. It's like we're helping facilitate the conversation around it, as opposed to saying that everything presented is the rock bottom truth. So that's just one element to add on to onto that. And then to sorry, your main question. Sorry, go ahead.
How do you introduce this to your client?
Yeah, so I think what we found is that you want to be very incremental in how you introduce something. Everyone's at different stages. And if we were to start every presentation with, okay, everyone get out their VR headset and AR headset that we mailed to you and set it up, and then we'll all jump into a headset, there's always going to be that person that's like, no chance. I'm not putting that thing on my face. You're not. No, not doing it. So what we start is sort of like how we saw here. It's like I'll present, but you can see both my screen and me at the same time. And then we'll give you a link, and then you can look at this geospatial view of content. And then we'll go in and look at some other examples. So seeing that incremental progress helps people see how they could use it themselves. And in full transparency, the most aha moment everyone always has is when they see their own data in Flow. Up until then, it really feels theoretical and it's like, oh, I could see how that might work for that use case, but I don't know if it's gonna work for me. And then when they do see their data, that's when it really hits, where it's like, oh, wow, okay. I even found something I didn't know before anyways. So anyways, that's always an exciting moment to go through with the customer. And Jason, do you wanna add more to that process?
No, well described.
I mean, where do you guys see things going on the, broader, scale with all of these technologies, your kinds of platforms?
Yeah, well, I actually think that, I alluded it to in my opener, which is that if data is oil or electricity or internet access, how do you get it to the last mile? How do you get it to the last internal centimeters inside of your head. How do you, build these shared mental models? And I would argue that, every enterprise presentation should be more data focused than it is. And that as time goes by here, we're going to see that this is the norm. A few bar charts isn't going to cut it when you're having a serious conversation at some point in the future. Will it feel more like sci-fi? Maybe a little bit, but I think what it will feel like is more like control, and it'll be the norm. I expect that data storytelling will be the way that we communicate powerfully about, public policy and finances, and a lot of aspects today that have more consistently been anecdotes or very simple pie charts.
Yeah.
And do you think
one other
complexity
thing-
of data is adding to this need? I think so, right? Because there's just the complexity and the sheer volume of data, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on that front, actually one other element related to the credibility of causation versus correlation is that one answer to the more data problem is machine learning and AI. And if you develop a black box that gives you an answer but doesn't show you how it got that answer, there are a lot of issues, right, in terms of what it's using to really calculate the outcome. And so in a very similar sense, it might be making causal relationships that are not really there and impacting decisions. And so that's why it's partially that, or mainly true, that decisions are still mostly human in nature. It's not all just described by an AI unless we understand how it's coming up with those suggestions or recommendations and using some human judgment involved. So I think that's another sort of other trends that we've seen with the increase of data availability and volume.
Yes, yes. Alan, you have another question?
Yeah. So this was sort of spurred by you guys talking, and you mentioned that there's 3 areas that you focus on: financial services, consulting, and public policy. I guess I wonder, how far are we away from a world where we could have a public policy debate and have a data visualization be at the center of that, where if someone makes a claim that, we could in real time be able to visualize the data that would either substantiate or detract from, is the person exaggerating or are they on point, and, use it to I know what I said before about statistics, but I guess what I'm asking here is to what degree can we use this technology to be a force for clear-mindedness and rational discussions about topics? Obviously you can take what you have and write a report, but how far are we away from like a real-time visualization that would be an augmentation to a conversation?
Was it Tim Cook who described augmented reality as augmenting every serious conversation in front of us as we have the conversation? I think he said that in the last few weeks. So he's going to know. Obviously, I have my view of the future, and we're building it. They are also building it in a very exciting way. And but I do think that you just described a fascinating vision. It requires plenty of machine learning to understand the conversation that's going on and be, doing real-time lookups of data that could be enhancing that. Standardization of data, publicly available standardized data is a non-trivial thing when you look at the expanse of the kinds of data in the world. But yeah, that's a very exciting vision. Let's pull up, instead of saying, hey, Google, every time we want to refute or validate our points in a conversation, we can instead say, hey, Flo, show me what this is actually doing. Is this going to, is this person up and up, and where's the exaggeration? And let me understand this from that viewpoint. You've just given us an idea. Maybe we'll have to give you credit on the patent.
Well, because I was looking at a database recently, which was put together by the Washington Post. It had to do with, tracking police actions across the country in order to bring some sanity to a very hot button topic of our times. And so they didn't have the data visualization that you had, but the goal was still to allow people to, and in fact, anybody can go, right? You can go to the database and you can enter your criteria and you can filter it and you can get concrete answers to questions that would presumably inform the conversation. I just think I see in what you guys are doing, that database from the Washington Post on steroids. And, I guess the challenge that I see is how to take that and make it a force for not to be a cliche, a force for good, I guess, or, not to drive people apart but to bring them together because there's a common view of the data.
Yeah, I have a strong perspective on one key element, which is I'm sort of on a mission right now to get people to stop publishing data dashboards. Because
data what?
Data dashboards.
Oh, data
so
dashboards.
To build a data repository or a dashboard, because the intent is good, right? It's exactly what you mentioned. I have a question I would like answered. I'm going to go to this platform and I'm going to find my insight. But what you found, I think, is actually a very small section of the population that wants to take that initiative and has the ability to digest the information, understand the visualization, and get to the conclusion. And I think what you'll find is that the person that made that viz and did all the research, they have a very strong opinion. They have some insights that they found along the way. And what they really need to do is start to tell stories from there. And so one thing we've been exploring, I think it's sort of this combination, is this idea of, yes, you can still have a dashboard for a set number of users that have, expertise, but to enable them to then tell stories from that dashboard, I think is a really exciting moment. So we very much focus on that story element, because it's through storytelling that you reach that larger audience and you drive action, as opposed to just having access to the data and instilling this idea that everyone should go and explore it themselves. So I think that's sort of core to our mission, is that we are focused on the story as opposed to just the data elements of it. And I think that's sort of so that's been our sort of mission in life, I guess.
Michael, one quick thing that just came to mind as I was thinking about this. So you have data, but then you have the visualization, but you're going really beyond that. So there's data, the visual, and then the actual narrative. I'm just trying to sort of piece that together, in my head, because the visuals can tell you something, but you need that maybe expert view to tell the story, to interpret that.
Yeah.
And like you said, storytelling is an ancient practice. And so we are wired to hear story because stories are emotional, right? Am I correct? So there's that component.
There's so many aspects of this that we could go on all day. We should
try to
avoid that. But there's a whole model of visual thinking.
Okay.
Right. And I think our education system has very much focused English. And after about second grade, we stopped doing art, at least every student in the class, right? But there's something about the hummingbird versus the fox. Okay, a fox is going to cunningly walk you through a forest or a field and tell you about the different aspects of it. It's pre-planned and it's a linear thing. A hummingbird is going to glance at that field and see all the flowers and get this immediate sense. Yeah. And yes, it's a feeling. It's hard to, it goes beyond words, but that, I call that visual thinking. I'm actually borrowing these terms from Dan Roam, R-O-A-M. So look him up if you're interested in following this idea further. He's got some really great books on this. But so the combination, it's easy to say, it's all about the story. And of course, data viz people and dashboards, it's all about the visualization. And we keep coming back to, it's all about both. It's how you put them together. It's and for us, and for the world, I mean, I think what we all need are better tools to do this. And we don't have those tools. We do not have those tools to date. So
To do
that's,
it quickly and easily, Jason, right?
yeah, it's got to be
That's
quick and
key
easy. And
too.
and so we've actually got two levels of tools. We've got the flow. We've got an editor, which enables people to start with the data and build anything you can think of.
Okay.
And then we're just bringing out our next piece, which is, it's a story dashboard. It says, take that flow that someone else did a bunch of hard work to munch the data to get the
Yeah.
basic visualizations done. Now I've got it. Oh, let me highlight these elements and turn that into a step, a slide. Let me spin it this way and focus on this. Let me, zoom into this region of time. They can then tell their story with that, but that is still a dynamic document. Someone else can come along and rearrange it and tell the story their own way. That set of people aren't dealing with the complexity of data. They're just like, oh, I want to click here and select this country, and there it is, and that's what I need. And to give the right level of complexity at the right time so that you have an ecosystem of data story creation, from the most expert data scientist to the CEO who's got a board presentation in 20 minutes. How can he use this as well?
I mean, what are you telling your clients in terms of return on investment also on, in this technology and this platform, this way of thinking?
Michael?
Yeah, so it's, as you might imagine, a very difficult thing to measure for certain instances. There are some very direct measurements when it comes to marketing, which is why part of our focus has been sort of the sales and marketing use case, where if we're closing a percentage greater sales or lessening the time to close, that those have hard metrics behind them. So I can't go into details on all the metrics, but what I can tell you is that the more immersive the environment, the more engaged an audience member is, and the deeper they understand the content is what we found. And so, we can basically point to stats of comparing, what did just a normal Zoom call do for you versus having this meeting in Flow, and how did that enhance your sales process? And so that's been one way we can calculate it. But for many other instances where it's a little looser, and that's part of why earlier I said the internal use case has not been as much of a driver, because exactly to that point, it's much harder to point to the specific ROI other than everyone is actually engaged in the meeting and talking, and everyone loves it, and people are actually using it, which is, a difference, different benefit that's a little less about enterprise value and more about collaboration and people's preferences for software, I guess. But that's a bit of how we measure it.
Are there other unique use cases that you can share with our audience that either are coming up or could be applied beyond the industries you are currently engaged in?
I can show one. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick here. And so this is, definitely more experimental, but this is looking at the balance sheet, cash flow, and income statement for a public company. Which are universal things, right, that exist in the world. And as I progress things forward, this idea that we can build something that's truly interactive in a 3D environment and shows you basically this hierarchy of information. So as an example, if I click on balance sheet, I can actually go through the different levels of this hierarchy and pull in relevant information. So this is just a prototype, so I'm not going to put too much emphasis or stock on the visualization itself, but this idea that you can, actually go through an organizational hierarchy, basically hierarchical information in an immersive space, I think is really interesting. It sort of extends out what we're talking about when we say what is data, to mean a little bit more. But I think that's one sort of exciting area that we've been exploring a bit further.
We lost you for a minute. Can you hear?
Nope.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, sure. Alan, do you have another question? Please go ahead.
I do. And this is sort of a general question. And again, I don't know if it applies specifically to Flow, but I imagine that you guys have thought about it. So, I actually collect a lot of data, even with the small thing that we do here in the Symposium. And one of the things that I struggle with is taking that data and finding ways to clearly draw conclusions. So for example, I can measure that, attendance is going up or attendance may be going down. It's a lot harder to figure out, getting back to causation, why are these things happening, and what is the sentiment of the audience, and what steps can we take to improve the end user experience? And so I just wonder whether you guys could talk a little bit more on how you go from the data to the visualization to the analysis to actionable steps to improve the enterprise.
Want to take that, Jason?
Sure, I'm happy to, but I think you've got it on the tip of your tongue, I bet.
No, go for it.
So, one of the things we still remind people is we're not competing with Tableau or Power BI or R scripts or Python analysis. We don't consider this visualization to be a big data visualization system. That you still need to have some expertise and at some level have some data science, data analytics experience to get started. That's not true of every data set, but complex data sets, that's still very, very true. And then, so if we're not competing with Tableau, then of course, what are we doing? We're that communication layer. So I think that we're less about helping you find those insights, although sometimes in 3D, they really do stand out.
Yeah,
nicely and beautifully, certainly. But we're less about helping you find those insights than communicating about them. So you'll see something in your data if you put it into Flow around attendance and all those bits. And you might start to see some multi-dimensional aspects of it that are powerful, like the number of minutes people are on a call in different areas, different time zones they're in, and you start to, because you can see more than 2 dimensions at once, there are things that do jump out. But very often depending on the level of complexity of the customer need, we do start with either an internal data analyst or an external, from their own company to get us started on the story. And people, they do have, pretty quickly will find that you'll have a viewpoint on your data and want to do and see that. So then it's how do you construct that and visualize it as effectively as possible to communicate it.
Yep.
Okay. Doesn't completely solve your problem, but then again, we're solving. If you wanted to take that data and go to a funding organization and help them understand how their funding is going to help you be more effective and double your attendance next year, that's something that would be a really powerful use case.
Well, I think what I'm hearing from you is that what this can do is take the data that I have and present it in a way where I can drive a conversation with subject matter experts and help tease out what our plan of action would be. I mean, because if you just have a pile of data, even if it's put into some kind of set of charts, it becomes very hard, I think, for people to absorb it. And I think that's where the struggle I have is sometimes that, it's hard to put the data in a way where you can really drive that conversation. And so I think that could help a lot.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I just had this visual in my mind of your data, like a round table in effect, with your data in the center and this round table of people having a discussion. Am I off the wall here? But I just
exactly
that.
Yeah,
I just had this powerful visual of sitting around, a round table and everyone's seeing the same things.
In some ways, we've discovered that people like to stand up instead of sit down, and
stand up.
And we literally do that with either with augmented reality on people's phones or tablets, or with Magic Leap, like an augmented reality headset, which is so freeing to just have it floating there, and you can point at it, you can grab it, and everybody sees what you're pointing at, and it feels very sci-fi and very real and concrete.
What I'm hearing is dynamism, right? There is, that movement, that dynamism in the data,
Right.
and the people who are interacting, right? And hence the story evolves from that. If I'm making
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, very much so. Collaborating around data is an important part of the story. It's not an authoritarian model where a presenter is talking down to his audience. It's a sage on the side where everyone is having a good conversation together.
No, I love that as a wonderful conclusion here. And, we're really, so Alan, do you have anything else to add?
No, I mean, I just want to say that, for me personally, this was a fantastic presentation. I got a lot out of it. I think that although we didn't have as many live attendees as we might have wanted to, I think that there are a lot of people are going to be watching this recording.
Yes, yes. So I would like to really sincerely and gratefully thank you both, Jason and Michael, for being here today and really showing us what the future, what's happening now, really, right? And what the future could possibly bring as we move towards that more collaborative, interactive, fact-based maybe world where we can actually gain those insights. And as Alan asked about, can we work together and see this data simultaneously? So I'm walking away with that visual of a roundtable with the data in the middle. Thank you so very much. Do you have any last insight to share with our audience that we can leave them with?
Yeah, I'll close out, and then Jason can close things off for real. But thank you guys so much for having us. This is a wonderful discussion, and I think we're both learning, right? In many regards, you are also learning how to effectively communicate while virtual, right? You're championing the movement of in-person to virtual, and lots of learnings along the way. And I think we're part of that paradigm, and we are the part that focuses more on the data elements. But we think that's a very critical piece to have an engaging conversation. There's lots of other elements we're all hitting upon. So, this thing that we're a part of, right? This move towards virtual, and how do we have better conversations around data? And actually, our slogan used to be collaborate around data. So your vision, Chitra, is exactly on target there of how do you imagine this. But yeah, that we're all driving towards this metaverse where we spend most of our life, digital. Like even when we were a couple of years ago doing more in-person meetings, there was still always a few people that were virtual. It feels like inevitable that there was always someone remotely connected. And so we're just part of that transition and shift. It's not something completely new. So yeah, Jason, do you want to?
Oh, I just like to leave the last sentence with, I feel that humanity has some significant complex problems. I don't think that's, a lot of people would argue with me on that point. We need to figure out how to solve them, and trying to dump our solutions into PowerPoint, which dumbs everything down with maybe a couple of bar graphs, is not going to get us where we need to go. So I'm talking, global problems, every enterprise, every nonprofit, they've got to have a way that we can solve humanity's problems better. And we feel as part of our mission be in the middle of that conversation.
Oh, well, I think, thank you again. That's a wonderful way to leave this. I think your value system and the way you're thinking about this is aligned certainly with me. And we look forward to hearing more about Flow Immersive's evolution moving forward. Thank you all so much. And thanks to everyone for joining.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Uh-huh.